Hello. Welcome to a session where we learn orthodontics in an easygoing way over a cup of coffee. I'm Senior Ji Dae Kim from Ortho Barista.
And I'm Junior Lee Junguk from Ortho Barista. In June, we had a session about partial orthodontic correction for front teeth. However, there were many things we didn't get to cover at the time.
That's right. So, as soon as we got approval for additional content, we planned Part 2, clinical cases of partial orthodontic correction. But before diving into today's topic, we need to have a special Ortho Barista moment, right? 1, 2, 3.
들어보려고. 자,
Let's try that again. 1, 2, 3.
커피 한 잔 내려요.
You've been waiting, haven't you?
The sweet dessert we've prepared to go with today's coffee is tiramisu.
Just looking at it makes me want to eat it.
The correct Italian pronunciation is tiramisu. The word comes from the Italian verb diral, meaning to pull. Mi means me, and su means up. So together, it translates to pick me up or cheer me up.
Tiramisu does have a way of making people feel better.
The first tiramisu was originally created as a way to recycle leftover cookies that had gone stale after being sold. The dessert consists of cookies soaked in espresso, alternating layers of custard cream mixed with mascarpone cheese, and is topped with cocoa powder.
It's a dessert that pairs perfectly with coffee, don't you think? Tiramisu isn't just sweet, it has a slight bitterness.
And sometimes even makes you cough. You know when you accidentally inhale powder.
Should I try air suction or something?
All right.
But knowing the meaning behind its name makes it even more delicious and uplifting. Now, shall we move on to tiramisu ing, our front teeth?
앞니, tirare.
Now, let's talk about today's topic. Back in June, we discussed key considerations and principles of partial orthodontic correction for front teeth. In Part 2, we will focus more on clinical cases. We'll be covering special multifunctional brackets, as well as lingual braces and clear aligners in a collaborative discussion. Even in full comprehensive orthodontic treatments, not just partial corrections, rotation control often remains a challenge until the very end.
Many practitioners struggle with cases where the teeth haven't fully rotated as expected during the final stages of treatment.
Here's a helpful tip. When handling rotation control, we usually rely on the resilience of wires. While it's not exactly about elasticity, we often use nickel titanium wires, thin 024 SS wires, or step-up bends to improve rotation. Other approaches include attaching lingual buttons and using elastics, adjusting the base thickness of brackets, or utilizing special brackets designed for better rotation control. One of the brackets we'll discuss today is the A1 Smart Bracket. To be clear, we are not promoting a specific product, we just want to explain its clinical applications. Visually, these brackets might seem bulky in diagrams, but in reality, they are quite compact and cute.
As I get older, I feel like I can barely see those tiny holes anymore.
Even when using 014 or 016 wires, I sometimes feel nervous about inserting them correctly.
These brackets are so small that placing the wire can be a delicate task.
The variety in slot direction, hole size, and position allows for multiple wire insertion options, making them extremely useful for rotation control. Since they also have a low profile, they work well in deep bite cases and allow for flexible bracket positioning. That's why we refer to them as multifunctional brackets.
So, it's not like this is some extraordinary bracket. But personally, I find it quite interesting to use. When it comes to partial orthodontics, the base surface of the bracket is often more rounded rather than flat, making it not so easy to attach and remove. However, this one functions just like a typical bracket, where you simply apply resin to attach it, and it's also very easy to remove. It's also very small. So, I'm just sharing my personal experience with using it. When performing partial orthodontics, even if we place the appliances exactly where we want them, once the wire gets thicker, we often find that the rotation remains incomplete. Instead of rotating fully, the mesial side tends to stick out while the distal side rotates inward. As mentioned earlier, we can address this by adding banding or adjusting the thickness of the resin base. Specifically, increasing the resin base thickness on the distal side can help apply more pressure for better positioning. The A1 bracket, however, features multiple functional slots that are advantageous for rotation, making it easier to resolve these issues. Here, I've taken photos at different stages to demonstrate this process. Typically, when we insert a wire, situations like this are common. Even if the size is correct, the rotation may be insufficient. The special feature of this bracket is that it allows us to insert an additional wire, which helps in improving rotation. What does this mean? Essentially, the main wire is inserted in the usual manner, but each hole has two openings on one side. If we consider the yellow wire as the main wire, inserting an additional wire in the green direction applies extra rotational force.
Some of you might be familiar with the concept of a rotation wedge. This functions similarly.
Yes, exactly like a rotation wedge. Applying a rotation wedge here follows the same principle. Since this technique uses a very thin wire, the counteracting forces are not excessively strong. Of course, we still need to consider the reactive forces, but I believe this method is quite effective for rotation control. Additionally, since the bracket has two vertically aligned holes, it is useful for extruding teeth. If we engage the wire in the upper hole too soon, it may generate excessive vertical force, which can negatively affect adjacent teeth. To counter this, we initially insert the wire into the lower hole and then move it to the upper hole as the tooth moves downward. This allows for better height adjustment. While this technique is not foolproof, it offers more versatility compared to standard partial orthodontic brackets.
However, one of the biggest challenges is managing side effects like the roller coaster effect. In conventional brackets, we typically use a figure-8 tie, but with mini brackets, this technique can be more difficult.
Unavoidable counteracting forces arise with any orthodontic system. Most conventional partial orthodontic brackets have limitations in providing sufficient anchorage.
Tiramisu isn't just sweet.
Given the wide variety of partial orthodontic appliances available, choosing the right one is crucial. This particular bracket has a rectangular shape, which offers some mechanical advantage. Since a figure-8 tie can be used with this bracket, it provides a slightly better grip. If we look at a clinical case, you can see that the bracket is very small. After about 3 to 4 months, if the crowding is resolved, the results are similar to what you'd expect from any partial orthodontic system. However, I do have one minor complaint: the mesiodistal width of the bracket is a bit too small. While this isn't a significant issue in the lower arch, in cases requiring rotation control, a slightly wider MD width might allow for more effective and gradual rotation. In this case, the patient was a suitable candidate for either comprehensive or partial orthodontic treatment. Based on various considerations, we thought that partial orthodontics was a viable option. For cases where the tooth axis is tilted, using this bracket can help achieve better outcomes. This image shows the treatment in progress. However, it's important to note that this setup involves a certain degree of risk. If positioned this way, significant counteracting forces will be generated. But how does this work in principle? So, when a bracket is placed like this, if the wire is inserted from one side and exits the other, it will inevitably create a rotational force. This principle is applied to engage the wire in such a way that it helps with rotation control, ensuring that the distal side moves inward.
It may seem like a similar question, but in this case, wouldn't the counteraction be more severe?
Yes, it's quite strong. Actually, if it's done this way, I don't think it's ideal. However, since this patient's treatment needed to progress quickly, I checked their progress almost every week. Just in case, because neighboring teeth may either extrude or sink due to the counteracting forces, extra caution is needed. Fortunately, in this case, the patient was lucky, and no such issues arose. Since this patient needed to complete the treatment quickly, I conducted weekly checkups. The treatment took approximately 8 months, though the patient went abroad briefly, causing slight variations in the timeline. Still, it was completed in about 8 months. This case was a successful one. Of course, there are unsuccessful cases as well. However, I wanted to showcase this case because this type of bracket can be useful for these types of corrections.
Also, if rotation control is not handled properly, issues like dehiscence can occur.
As I showed in the first case, the main arch wire should be placed first, and additional auxiliary wires should be used to support adjacent teeth. Now, let's talk about counteracting forces. When placing partial orthodontic brackets, we often see cases where the distal side is slightly protruded outward. To control this rotation, the wire should be inserted from the outer side toward the inner side. However, this approach can create strong counteracting forces, potentially leading to issues like dehiscence or other unintended movements. In orthodontics, unwanted movements are inevitable, so careful handling is required. That's why instead of inserting the wire directly, it's better to first place the main arch wire. Since there is some degree of play in the system, applying force through the auxiliary wire doesn't result in a perfectly fixed outcome. So, by placing the main arch wire first and then inserting the auxiliary wire starting from that point, the auxiliary wire will end at this location. In this setup, the tooth can exhibit effects such as mesial out and distal in movements. For this reason, I usually see patients every 1 or 2 weeks during rotation control, rather than waiting for 4 weeks, because unexpected protrusions can occur if the intervals are too long.
This might be discussed later, but when gaps form in cases like this, using clear aligners in collaboration with brackets could be a viable approach.
These days, clear aligners can be used in such cases without significant interference. Later, I'll demonstrate how aligners can be a great collaborative tool in orthodontics, as they are very thin and easy to insert and remove. Now, moving on to 2D brackets, these are very well known. I believe I first used them around 2011, so it's been about 12 years now. They are extremely thin. Because they are so thin, debonding them can be challenging.
It feels similar to metal bases where the wings have been removed.
Since they are placed on the lingual side, using pliers for removal is tricky, and sometimes I end up grinding them off. When I consulted a manufacturer about this, they suggested that these brackets could also be used as retainers. That makes sense in some cases, but I still prefer to replace retainers when needed. The way the clips open is also somewhat unique. They can be pinched and released, but after about 10 to 20 times uses, they may fall off. Still, they are very small and useful. When attaching brackets, I use tweezers to set the angle properly. This is just my method, but it can be tricky for assistants to hand them to the doctor correctly. To make this easier, the long axis of the tweezers should be aligned parallel to the bracket. Always keep this in mind. Now, let's look at a case example. This is a common and relatively mild case. I'm not saying that every case can be treated with clear aligners or partial braces. Proper diagnosis is key. We must evaluate occlusion, COCR discrepancy, and other factors before deciding on treatment. For instance, in this patient, the posterior occlusion isn't aligned properly. If it is determined that there are no major issues, then we proceed with partial orthodontic treatment or clear aligners. This is one of the most common cases. The upper arch is treated with 2D brackets, while the lower arch is treated with labial brackets, a combination approach sometimes called combi partial orthodontics. I documented the process step by step. The intervals were every 3 weeks, after 3 weeks, then 6 weeks. So the teeth moved in this pattern. By the 9th week, there was noticeable movement, and the progress was relatively fast. For the lower arch, we placed the brackets on the outer surface. As previously mentioned, for rotation control, we used a lingual button.
When placing the appliance on the upper arch, you attach it directly, correct?
Yes, in some cases, indirect bonding is used, but I am not sure. Since I have always done direct bonding, I find that there are some aspects that require careful adjustments depending on the placement. However, for partial orthodontic treatments, I almost always use direct bonding. For those who are less familiar with the technique, indirect bonding is certainly an option. For cases involving butterfly-shaped crowding, using a lingual button with a power chain helps achieve effective movement. If upper arch treatment takes about 9 to 10 weeks, the lower arch takes approximately 15 weeks for alignment alone. Of course, if additional retention is needed, a separate solution must be considered. When comparing before and after, I wanted to illustrate that this is the typical timeframe for 2D orthodontic treatment. I used the same approach for another patient, 2D brackets on the upper arch and labial brackets on the lower arch. However, I initially questioned whether partial orthodontics would be feasible in this case. This patient was actually treated back in 2012. Looking at the initial condition, you can see that it was quite severe, right? After a thorough diagnosis, we proceeded with treatment. When bonding 2D brackets, it can be challenging to place them ideally in some areas. In such cases, do you wait until space is created, or do you place smaller brackets in the meantime? In this case, I opted to place smaller brackets temporarily. Even if the brackets were small, I placed them slightly off to the side and later repositioned them to achieve proper alignment. Depending on the case, occlusal corrections may be necessary. In such instances, we sometimes use resin buttons for minor adjustments. The process does not necessarily take a long time, but in some cases, the brackets are extended to the fifth tooth. For cases involving significant crowding, direct bonding is possible for labial brackets, but not for lingual ones. My approach is to attach brackets wherever possible and gradually adjust their positions.
Some of our viewers might be wondering how you create space for tooth number 11. Did you use an open coil spring?
In this case, we primarily used interproximal reduction. If an open coil spring were used, there could be unwanted side effects on the adjacent teeth. In 2D orthodontics, I find that it is more challenging to control such reactions. Given the amount of space needed, careful IPR was sufficient to achieve proper alignment. For locked-in teeth, this case was relatively successful. If a tooth is locked on the labial side, it can simply be pulled forward. However, with lingual locking, movement can feel more restricted. Nevertheless, once adequate space is secured, progress is still possible. Comparing results at 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months, the tooth was successfully repositioned without the use of a bite resin. When dealing with locked-in teeth on the lingual side, if diagnosed correctly, they can still be moved effectively using an appropriate expansion approach. However, some patients prefer lingual brackets over labial ones. While clear aligners can be a viable option, certain patients do not want them. In this case, if you look at the patient's bite, the lower arch is perfectly centered. For 2D treatment in such cases, the brackets must be attached precisely in the center, which can be quite difficult. Here's an interesting case. I use 2 brackets instead of 1 for better control. The issue is that if we place the brackets too far towards the gingival side, it won't align properly. Even if the center aligns, the incisal tips will still be uneven. So, placing them here won't work. Instead, we can connect them to the outer side using a tube.
Which can be an interesting tip.
This approach can be used, of course. A common question is, won't it fall off if it touches? If it falls off, we obviously can't use it. However, it can be placed in a way that won't cause it to fall off. I've tried this method before. Depending on the situation, sometimes we can use lingual devices on the upper and lower arches to address partial alignments, especially if there's a slightly square shape. If approached from the inside, you can use an elastic thread to help shape the arch. This may not have been the primary intent, but it can still help with shaping the arch. In cases with the lower arch, where there's a 3-unit bridge with a pontic in the middle, we can cut the pontic and use that space to align the teeth, then redo the crown bridge. There are many ways to use these techniques. I often do partial lingual orthodontics, both for the upper and lower arches. Lastly, here's a case where one tooth was unusually protruding. After a thorough diagnosis, the lower tooth was extracted. I removed this tooth and placed a pontic with resin. By rotating the tooth, I aligned it. You may be wondering, what is this image? To achieve rotation, I had to move the tooth in a distal direction. However, at the time, I couldn't attach the device directly, so I placed a resin button on the outside to apply force. This helped move tooth number 41 to the left while rotating it. This method allowed rotation control, and through careful rotation, I managed to align the teeth. It's possible to do partial lingual extraction orthodontics in some cases. Of course, the case itself is very important. Not all situations are suitable for this approach. It requires careful consideration. If the case is appropriate, lingual orthodontics can be effective. With proper case selection, lingual partial orthodontics can be used successfully in clinical practice. Was I moving too quickly?
Now, onto collaboration.
Collaboration is something that can be done between musicians, clothing designers, and even in orthodontics. As I mentioned earlier, partial orthodontics and clear aligners collaborate very well. Of course, it would be great if we could achieve results with a single method, but right now, Magic Align is widely used. The material improvements have helped make rotation control effective even with partial orthodontics alone. In the past, there were cases that combined 2D orthodontics with clear aligners. When there's leftover space from partial orthodontics, closing the gap can be difficult. Also, partial orthodontics can sometimes cause the teeth to protrude a bit when they align. In those cases, clear aligners help refine the movements.
Clear aligners target the desired movement, while other teeth can be anchored with partial orthodontics. This combination seems to work well.
The 2D devices are quite thin, so they don't create much resistance when being placed or removed. This case is one I recently finished. The patient requested to align only the lower teeth. Among several clear aligner options, the patient wasn't confident with the removable ones, so we opted for partial orthodontics instead. The patient didn't want visible braces, so we chose lingual partial orthodontics. I placed 2D brackets on the upper arch and used a regular tube on the lower arch. After placing the tube, tooth number 41 protruded forward. In my opinion, when it comes to anterior-posterior tooth movement, clear aligners are more effective than partial orthodontics. So, I decided to combine 2D brackets with clear aligners, using the aligners to retract the protruded tooth and the 2D system to align the crowding. The reason I approached it this way is that the axis of tooth number 41 was significantly tilted. I really wanted to upright it. So instead of bonding a 2D bracket on the lingual side of number 41, I used a tube-type attachment. In the end, this case was completed using that kind of collaboration.
In our chat, one of the most frequent questions, especially when doing partial orthodontics, was about black triangles. We've answered many of these questions, such as with resin buildup or additional IPR. How do we handle patients with these concerns? Is there room for further progress in such cases?
Actually, when the tooth tilts like that, once it's corrected, new spaces may appear immediately. If the patient hasn't been informed, they might think their gums have suddenly collapsed, but we must provide thorough guidance. It will definitely happen, and if we make the necessary corrections to the teeth, I believe the black triangles will reduce. Ultimately, for such cases, instead of focusing on IPR, we can either leave the space as is or use resin buildup to address it.
Of course, proper communication is essential. Clear aligners might seem easily approachable to general practitioners, but, as mentioned earlier, there are various reactions or complications that could arise. In practice, though, these can sometimes lead to unexpected challenges. I hope that today's session has provided some helpful tips for you all. Next time, I'll talk about setting up an orthodontic office. In a way, this might have been the first thing we should have done, and I've been thinking about it. I'll show you how we set up our office and share tips from other orthodontists on how they set up their clinics. We'll have some time to introduce these ideas to you all. It should be fun.
Recently, someone asked if we could do something like this, so we've prepared it.
When we do offline clinical lectures, we often get asked questions like, how should we set up the dental clinic? We get a lot of those questions, so we decided to prepare something bold for you all. I hope you enjoyed today's session with some sweet desserts in the afternoon while having a great clinical time. Thank you.
Thank you.